Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. Resident Evil Village is a hard game to talk about. Because on the one hand, it is a very high quality game, it's made some notable improvements on 7, has a lot of similarities to Resident Evil 4, which is my favorite game in the franchise. But on the other hand, it's also a hot mess. It is such a strange combination of concepts that don't really quite blend. It seems to me like they tried to make a Resident Evil game that would appeal to all corners of the fan base, and as a result, it doesn't really appeal to anybody perfectly. Now, if you do like Resident Evil 7, you'll probably like this, because it is pretty similar, but all of the additional action elements that they added to the game just don't quite mesh well, because they didn't go all in on them. And so the question is Resident Evil 8 worth buying at launch? Well, by the time this video releases, you'll have made that decision. So I guess the new question is, should you wait for a price cut? Well, before we get into this, remember to do the things the algorithm likes. It's really important for a small channel like me if you like, comment, subscribe, etc, etc. You know the deal. And check me out on Patreon if you want to support me directly. So without further ado, let's grab some mommy milkers.
Your funeral.
So if you played Resident Evil 7, this gameplay style should be pretty familiar to you. Not a lot has actually changed mechanically. It's still a first-person shooter with a lot of horror elements, but the actual shooting aspect has been cranked significantly up, but still not enough. Or too much, depending on how you felt about the shooting in Resident Evil 7. Because honestly, I thought that was the worst part of the game. The molded were just not a very interesting enemy type to fight. They were pretty unresponsive to gunfire, unless you had the double-barrel shotgun that just blew off their head in like one shot. And generally, your movement was incredibly slow. Ethan Winters has to be the slowest character in first-person gaming. He sprinted at the speed of a land whale's light jog, which made backtracking around the Baker household very annoying. Luckily, the sprinting has been sped up a bit. The guard mechanic has been improved. Now, after guarding an attack, you can push back the enemy. And in general, the new enemy types are a lot more satisfying to shoot. The problem is you're not actually given that many enemies to shoot. There's only 2 main enemy types that appear for about 80% of the game, and that's the werewolves and the zombies. And the werewolves are a lot more fun to fight than the zombies, I'll say that much. If you've seen G-Man Live's review, I pretty much echo his sentiments on the zombies. For some reason, the zombies' heads don't explode, and so they just kind of awkwardly slump over when they die, and it's just not satisfying at all. And of course, they're about as slow as you would expect. Whereas the werewolves are actually pretty fast. They can sprint across the screen, but of course, on lower difficulties, they just kind of awkwardly stop in front of you and wait for you to shoot them. How convenient. And their heads explode in a satisfying, gory fashion. There's some bats, which are probably the 3rd most common enemy, but you only fight them about 5 times in the game. And the final semi-common enemy type are these weird Frankenstein guys that you shoot in their glowing weak point on their chest, which kind of remind me of the blind guys from Resident Evil 4, minus the blindness, of course, but same concept with the huge blades, in this case, like a drill on their arm. And this is just the first of many things in this game that remind me of Resident Evil 4. I mean, the very first major encounter in this game is a throwback to the village siege at the beginning of Resident Evil 4. Complete with boarding yourself up in a house, a shotgun, and of course the enemies mysteriously leaving at the end. The problem is, again, these are the only enemies you fight, and there's very little variation between them. Some are unarmed, some have swords or maces or clubs. There are some stronger variants. There's armored werewolves. There's the giant werewolf guy that you see in the intro. Giant wolf dudes. And there's a couple secret giant mini-boss zombies with axes, which are pretty cool. So I'd say the mini-boss and boss variety is completely fine, actually pretty good. It's just the common enemy types that not enough effort was put into. You would expect there to be like some kind of equivalent to the ranged enemy types from RE4 and 5, but all they have is one werewolf variant with flaming arrows, but you only fight him like twice. Something that was pretty much a staple for probably a third of the encounters in RE4 is barely in this game. The most obvious connection to Resident Evil 4 are the weapon upgrades through the merchant. And this fat new merchant actually references the original merchant.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say.
But then again, it's been like 15 years since Resident Evil 4 in universe, so it's kind of weird. I don't know how old this morbidly obese man is supposed to be, but whatever. And yeah, he functions much the same as the merchant from RE4. He can sell you gun upgrades. He actually sells you ammo, which is a step up from RE4's merchant. He can upgrade your guns. You can sell treasure to him, and oh yeah, there's a lot of treasure. And you can even shoot down the treasure in the environment, much like RE4. And you can even hunt animals in this game and cook special dishes which permanently upgrade one of your stats. So these all sound like improvements over RE7, right? Well, unfortunately, the biggest problem with the game is the pacing, which ties into its level design. Because the way that the game is structured is that there's 4 big bad guys you gotta take down in the village, the various children of Mother Miranda, who's the big bad. And so you travel to each of these 4 lieutenants' areas, and unfortunately, it's just a mess of concepts that just don't work. It feels like Capcom threw their shit at the wall to see what stuck, because the first section is sort of like the traditional Resident Evil place, the castle, which it feels like they blew their load early because it's the best part of the game, at least to me. Because there's puzzles, there's items that you have to use to unlock other parts, including the Rule of 4 that Resident Evil has done since the very beginning. It has invincible enemies that chase you, like RE7, though you take care of 3 out of 4 of them fairly easily. The daughters of Lady D were a complete pushover once you discover their weakness. And this whole section is roughly 2 hours, which feels just about right. The only problem I really have with the castle is that none of it feels scary at all. Especially since everyone on the internet has memed to death how attractive the giantess woman is. Lady D makes my D hard. I'm sorry, I just had to get that one out. And Lady Dimitrescu, while definitely being intimidating, is not at all scary. Capcom knew what they were doing with her exposed bust and voluptuous figure, and so it just doesn't really work anymore. I mean, from a gameplay perspective, it works fine, having to run away from this unstoppable character. And the daughters pull that off pretty well too, since they can fly through objects when they turn into a bunch of flies, which I think is a nice twist on the vampire concept. But yeah, at the end of 2 hours, you just kind of kill her and then you move on. And the following 2 areas are much worse than the castle. That's the problem. The doll section of the game is basically one long puzzle sequence that takes place in Ethan's mind. And the whole thing is just 45 minutes with no shooting. You have all these new guns. There's now 3 handguns and 3 shotguns. Again, somewhat similar to Resident Evil 4 or 5. And all these gun upgrades. And yet, for a good hour and a half of the game, you barely shoot anything. Because after you defeat the doll in that gimmicky hide-and-seek boss fight, you go to the lake, which kind of feels like another RE4 reference to Del Lago, except, again, it's stretched across the course of like an hour. And the only enemy you really fight is the boss. There's one mandatory fight with a bunch of werewolves in one part of the small mines. And then the rest is basically just running from Fish Boy as he turns into a giant man-eating fish. And then you drain the water and then you kill him. And then you move on. And that's it. Then there's a 30-minute straight fight scene where you fight like 100 werewolves and take out that giant one with the hammer from the beginning. And then you explore a giant factory for like another 2 hours, which is another highlight of the game. And so you see, like, there's a good hour and a half to 2 hours of the game where you barely fight any enemies. You shoot one boss and like a handful of werewolves. It just feels bizarre to have all these different weapons and weapon upgrades when you're only shooting enemies for about half the game. With something like Resident Evil 4 and 5, you're constantly shooting enemies. Constantly, because it's a shooter. They're action games. This feels like it wants to do horror and action, but doesn't blend them well. The Resident Evil 2 remake handled this a lot better. It still had weapon upgrades that you could find in the map, but you didn't actually like find treasure and get money and get these character upgrades and all these other kind of light RPG mechanics that would take away from the horror experience. But no, now it feels like Capcom wants to have its cake and eat it too and appeal to both the horror and action fans, and it just doesn't work perfectly. It's still a fun game, a very well-made game, but these mechanics and level design have not been thought out. The pacing is just all over the place. I haven't even talked about the village itself, which is like sort of a Metroidvania type of thing. Every time you beat one of the 4, the village layout changes and you have some item that can unlock some new houses. But the layout changes every time you go back to it, so there's less paths to travel around the village. And it's kind of a neat concept, but it's also kind of annoying because you can't navigate it the same way every time. And of course enemies spawn back there to give you something to shoot, which just kind of feels like padding at that point. And it's a neat idea. I always like Metroidvania elements, but again, just something about it feels off. It's hard to describe. And it's weird, there's certain optional elements of this game that I feel like they put more work into than maybe they should have, just because the main game is lacking in the actual mandatory main story events. I don't know what to call it really, but you know what I mean. Like for example, there's a bunch of secret treasures everywhere. There's like a crazy amount of them. And obviously you're going to need them because the gun upgrades get pretty expensive after a while, especially if you want to ditch your older, crappier guns for new guns. The last handgun and shotgun cost a shit ton, and so do their upgrades. But the problem is a lot of these take some serious backtracking. Even though you move faster, to go run back to the dollhouse area across the bridge multiple times just to get a couple optional treasures there is a pain in the ass. And it's not necessary, but they clearly put some real work into it. Especially after you get the boat key, you can ride up and down the river near this huge altar in the village, and it's this huge secret area. You get to discover some foreshadowing for the end of the plot in the secret cave. And you can even get back to like the exit to Castle Dimitrescu. And there's 2 special like puzzle rooms. There's one where you have to set an enemy on fire to light these torches, which I think is cool. And another one where you have to like raise and lower these spike traps to like get behind this locked gate. And all of it is completely optional, which is awesome. I love that. That's like the most open-ended game design that's been in a Resident Evil game in a long time, which is great. Another thing too is like all the boss fights are fun, and this is kind of a major spoiler, but near the end of the game, Chris Redfield, of course it's Chris, builds a makeshift tank that you use to take out the Magneto boss, I'll say that. Another thing that's weird about this game is that normal mode is way too easy. It's really weird. It takes something like 5 or 6 hits from full health to kill you without health upgrades. Did people complain about RE7 being too difficult? Why'd they make normal so easy in this? And there's hard, which, take this with a grain of salt because this is basically a friend of a friend telling me this, but supposedly hardcore is just a wee bit too difficult for your first run through, and it feels more appropriate for New Game Plus. I don't know how true that is. I didn't try it myself. But I've heard the sentiment multiple times that there should be a difficulty between normal and hard in this game. It's just too much of a gap. It didn't really ruin my experience that much, but yeah, normal was distractingly easy for most of the game. Well, you might be thinking, if you remember RE7 and its Madhouse difficulty, what about the hardest difficulty in this game, Village of Shadows? Well, it's definitely not as good as Madhouse. First of all, there's no fixed saving system, which I feel like would have went a long way to make this at least a little better. No, honestly, it just makes it so enemies knock you down to danger in one hit, which is to be expected, but you can still block to mitigate a lot of that damage. And also, they've changed some of the encounters, like some of the harder werewolves will show up earlier, like the archers, which are woefully underused. And you'll fight a few more of the armored ones with like the double blade arms and stuff. And so while it does change a few things, the biggest problem with it is that it's designed for New Game Plus. It's probably borderline impossible. Then again, speedrunners always find a way to nullify any thought of borderline impossible, but for the average person, it's probably going to be nearly impossible to beat this out of a new save, because the enemies are crazy bullet sponges to even your multi-upgraded handguns. A shotgun blast straight to the face will probably still take him out, but the enemies are more aggressive, there's more of them, there's harder variants, and even a couple of the boss encounters have been changed. So it's definitely designed around New Game Plus, much like RE5's professional difficulty, which I don't have a problem with, but it doesn't really have any nice gimmick going for it like Madhouse did when it rearranged a lot of the items in the Baker household, which kept things interesting. This does not do that, so it's a bit of a step down for sure. There's also a Mercenaries mode, but it's honestly about as good as you would expect based on what I said about the enemy variety already. It's just not that interesting. You've already killed hundreds of werewolves and zombies, and while you'll fight some more bats and some more Frankenstein glowy weak spot guys, it's just really not that interesting or fun. It's very similar to other Mercenaries modes in previous games. So I don't know, if you really like the shooting in this, you'll probably enjoy Mercenaries, but I wasn't really that entertained. They also have the same challenge system from Resident Evil 3 Remake, which really stretched that 4-hour long game way past it ever should have been, by connecting in-game challenges to the bonus points that you use to purchase infinite ammo and a few of the bonus guns. But some of the challenges are just kind of dumb, and others require you to play the game multiple times, so it just feels like padding. At the end of the day, I'm just conflicted. Like, how good is this game really? It's fun. It has a lot of fun moments. It throws a lot of different types of things at you. But again, that uneven pacing and the underdeveloped relationship between the shooting mechanics and the upgrades and the number of encounters and the enemy variety just kind of let me down a little bit. I felt unsatisfied. And the same can be said for the story. Story doesn't really matter that much in a Resident Evil game, so I won't waste too much time on this. But this game explains everything that happened in RE7 and some of the crazy stuff that happens in here too, which, yeah, major spoilers ahead, obviously. But it all culminates in the fact that Ethan is dead, and he's a mold person. Now, this raises a lot of questions about what happened in Resident Evil 7 that I don't think Capcom really thought about. Like, if Ethan is really a mold person, why were the molded attacking him over the course of Resident Evil 7? Was it because Evelyn was specifically ordering them to attack him? And if so, why? I thought he was supposed to be Evelyn's dad and Mia was supposed to be the mom, right? Since, as the notes that you read later in the game say, the E series of bioweapons, you know, were supposed to mimic children to lure you into a false sense of security, and so they wanted like a family unit. So why is she constantly trying to kill him, especially if he's already a mold person? And if it's because he couldn't be controlled for some reason, which is something they don't really explain, because they don't really explain any of it. They don't even explain how you die. Like, if you're a mold person, how do you even die at all? Like, assuming you have sufficient first aid, which I guess just makes so you can slap limbs back on, as we've seen multiple times. What does it take to really kill a mold guy? Why does getting hit by a club a few times kill you? If he can literally have his heart ripped out, because it's not a real heart, I guess. It's just, again, mold that looks like a heart. I don't know, you ask way too many questions. That being said, I did like the twist that Mia wasn't actually killed in the beginning, because of course Chris would never just gun down Mia. Not that this Chris Redfield really feels like Chris anyway. Now they want him to be like all PTSD ridden and like depressed from all his men dying, which I thought was a stupid plot in Resident Evil 6, and it's still stupid now. This is not Chris, but at least they changed his face from like that really shit redesign in RE7. I hated that. But yeah, the twist, of course, is that Mia was actually Mother Miranda using her power to shapeshift. And the final boss battle against her is pretty cool. It feels kind of like a Dark Souls fight, actually. Which I know I've compared things to the Souls games many times, but I'm just saying, it feels like one of those fights where you dodge over-the-top flashy moves. It's just that you happen to have guns. And to only cover a couple more brief points, because again, who cares about story in Resident Evil? There was one moment where Eisenberg, the Magneto Man, references Chris boulder punching.
That boulder punching asshole! But you're first!
I love that moment. But something that I actually hated was a retcon that apparently Oswell E. Spencer, the man who created Umbrella, was inspired by Mother Miranda, since Mother Miranda's immortal and she got her powers from the mold like 100 years ago. He was inspired by her to go look for like a virus that would ascend humanity, right? So what's the problem with this? Oh, one simple thing. As Spencer was dying of old age or whatever disease he had as well in RE5, why didn't he just think to go find Mother Miranda's village again and become immortal with the mold? It doesn't make any sense. Do you really think on his deathbed he was too proud to like get the mold shit that would make him live forever? No, this is just a bad retcon and it's just kind of cringe, I'll be honest. And the post-credit scene in this game is also kind of cringe. Because, again, major spoiler. Ethan dies at the end of this game. He does manage to rescue his daughter, which is the whole point of the game. And it fast forward like 15 years to when she's a teenager, and they're implying that she's going to be a future protagonist in Resident Evil, and it's just kind of cringe. Resident Evil has never been a franchise that struggled with strong female protagonists. Jill Valentine and Claire Redfield are some of the most well-known female protagonists in any media, pretty much. So why does Capcom feel like they have to make this into like a big deal? Especially since these games usually take place in the year that they come out or the year they're developed. So we shouldn't even see Rose for like another 15 years in the real world. So I don't know what their plans are, but that credit scene has me worried a bit. So in conclusion, what do I think about Resident Evil Village? Well, it's a good game. Honestly, it's even a great game, but it's not an amazing game. And that's kind of where I stand on it. It makes some very notable improvements on 7, but it also moves Resident Evil in the same direction that it's struggled with ever since Resident Evil 4. No, honestly, that's not even true. Probably ever since Resident Evil 3 or Code Veronica, where the games just become more and more action-y with each sequel, until it's not about horror anymore. And Resident Evil 8 is in that weird in-between, where it still tries to have some horror moments like the dollhouse, but most of the rest of it just feels like an action game with spooky looking enemies. Except that there aren't enough fights in the game for it to be a good action game. So the pacing is just up and down, left, right, whatever. One moment it's slow, one moment it's fast. And the weapon upgrading just feels tacked on because there's not enough fights. But I will say I was thoroughly entertained most of the way through. Even the slow moments, I was still more than interested to continue with the game. So it's definitely still a good game. It's the best game to come out this year so far, which is really not saying much because this is the only big game to release this year so far. But still, if you're a Resident Evil fan, I would definitely recommend picking it up. Not entirely sure if it's worth picking up at $60. The game is roughly 9 hours. It depends on how much optional content you're willing to do, including over an hour of cutscenes. But skipping most of the optional content, it's probably 8 hours long. Doing all of the optional stuff, it's closer to 10 hours. So whether or not that's worth it to you, I leave that up to you. But I will say this is not quite as good as I was hoping, but I'm not disappointed. I'll say that. So I'll leave you to your own conclusion. Hey guys, remember to do the things the algorithm likes if you haven't already. Thank you to all my patrons. I'm actually going to be fixing up my Patreon because I haven't done a lot with it in a while. The Patreon request videos are definitely going to be a slightly more regular thing, for sure. I'm going to make sure that they come out once a month, starting next month. It's completely my fault that I haven't kept to the schedule. I really have no excuses. But other than that, I don't know, what's up with you guys? You guys playing any interesting games? I don't know, tell me in the comment section below. I finished the Terminator Resistance game recently. That was actually pretty good. I'm actually going to find a way to start talking about some pretty good games that don't necessarily deserve their own video, but should be featured in some kind of video because I want to talk about them. So that'll be something that'll come out probably this month. And yeah, that's about it. Just keeping it simple. I'll see you next time, guys.